The auctioneer hammered the gavel down at $310 on a clear October morning in 2004 at the Bath County Estate Auction Yard outside Mount Sterling, Kentucky. And the man in the three-piece pinstripe suit, standing under the green canvas tent, let out a thin, dry laugh that carried across the gravel lot and turned the heads of the Kentucky horsemen who had been bidding on the cattle gates. Reginald Sterling Hatch was 50 years old, slim, his thinning chestnut hair combed back over a high forehead and held in place with pomade, a thin pencil mustache trimmed close above his lip, gold wire reading glasses pushed up onto his head, a heavy gold pocket watch chain looped across his charcoal gray waistcoat. He represented the estate of a Bourbon County widow named Lucy Coverdale, who had died in March, and the 1954 Federal 604M heavy-duty wrecker at the back of her late husband's barn had been the last lot on his list to sell. He had told the auctioneer privately that he would have accepted $50 for the truck and considered the lot closed. The 24-year-old farm equipment mechanic in the back row had just paid him $310. Wyatt Holloway folded his auction slip into the chest pocket of his canvas chore coat and walked through the gravel toward the back of the lot where the Federal sat. The truck was 42,000 pounds of cab-over heavy-duty rescue iron. The cab painted a faded Wagon Master red, oxidized to a chalky pink-brown along the body panels, and bone white along the upper edges. Dual round chrome headlight bezels pitted with green corrosion. The chrome Federal letters across the front of the cab tarnished to a dull pewter. The original Holmes W750 twin-boom assembly mounted on the rear deck, listing 3 degrees to the right, with both cables frayed, the wooden cargo deck planks rotted through, 3 of the 6 tires flat, and the word junk spray-painted in flaking yellow block letters across the driver's door. Wyatt had grown up looking at this truck from the school bus window every morning for 13 years. His grandfather, Thaddeus Holloway, was waiting at the trailer. Thad was 76 years old, a retired boilerman from the Brown-Forman Bourbon Distillery in Versailles, 5'9", lean and erect, with broad, bony shoulders and a slight stoop. Snow-white hair clipped short and parted on the left. A thick white mustache trimmed close, deep-set hazel eyes the color of a bourbon barrel, a permanently tanned face from 60 years of Kentucky sun. He wore a faded barn-red flannel shirt under a sleeveless brown canvas chore vest, faded blue dungarees held up with leather suspenders, scuffed brown leather work boots, and a battered tan straw cowboy hat with a worn gross-grain band. A hand-rolled wheat straw cigarette sat unlit between his fingers. Thad looked at the truck for a full minute without saying anything. He spoke quietly. He said, "Son, you bought Roy Coverdale's truck." Wyatt had known about Roy Coverdale since he was old enough to ride in his grandfather's pickup. Roy Coverdale had run Coverdale Hauling out of a small concrete block office on the edge of Mount Sterling for 11 years, working the rough horse country roads from Lexington up to Maysville and east into the Daniel Boone National Forest, pulling out stuck horse trailers and overturned tobacco wagons in the occasional Cadillac that had slid off a wet October road on a fox hunt morning. Roy had built the Federal 604M himself in 1969 when he came home from the Navy, fitting the Holmes W750 twin boom onto the rear deck of a war-surplus heavy fire rescue chassis in his own yard with the help of 2 men from the distillery. He had married Lucy Boggs from Paris in 1965 and they had a daughter, Naomi, born in 1968. Roy had died in March of 1984 when the loft of his own equipment barn collapsed on him during a freak spring tornado. He was 49 years old. Naomi was 16. The truck had been put in the barn that Roy himself had rebuilt that summer, and the widow Lucy had not sold it. She had paid the property tax on it for 20 years, and the federal had sat in that barn untouched while she lived alone in the farmhouse next door. Lucy had died in March of 2004, just past her 70th birthday, and the estate lawyer, Reginald Sterling Hatch, had been hired by a Lexington bank to liquidate the property. He had taken the position that the heavy wrecker was scrap iron and consigned it to the spring auction. Wyatt had been in the back of the tent because his grandfather had heard from a stable hand in Paris that Roy Coverdale's truck was going to be sold. They winched the federal onto Wyatt's borrowed gooseneck trailer that afternoon. Reginald Sterling Hatch stood under the tent and watched, the gold pocket watch chain catching the late October sun across his pinstripe waistcoat. And as Wyatt pulled out of the auction yard, the lawyer called across the gravel that when the boy was ready to admit defeat, the estate would not be willing to repurchase. Wyatt did not answer. Thad climbed into the passenger seat, and they drove the 17 miles south on Kentucky Route 460 toward the small white farmhouse Thad had lived in for 51 years. The dead federal rocking behind them on the gooseneck, the Holmes booms pointing at the blue Kentucky sky like two bent fingers. The restoration would take 20 years. Nobody knew that on the drive home. Wyatt worked his day job at a horse-trailer repair shop in Lexington during the week, and he drove the 40 minutes out to Thad's barn every Saturday and most Sundays. They started with the cab because Thad insisted. The original 707 cubic inch Continental Flathead 6 had not turned over in 20 years, and they pulled it out of the truck with a chain hoist and disassembled it on a stand in the barn. The bearings were salvageable, the crank true, the head needing only a careful regrind. They pulled the 5-speed manual, and they pressed new bushings into the shift tower. The first winter went into the engine and into stories about Roy Coverdale. Thad told Wyatt about the night in 1976 when Roy had pulled a Lexington veterinarian's Ford station wagon out of Stoner Creek in a flood and refused payment except for a bottle of bourbon. He told Wyatt about the morning in 1980 when Roy had hauled a stuck Alice Chalmers tractor out of a tobacco field in Paris and let the farmer pay him in cured ham. He told stories about Lucy Coverdale's lemonade. The second year, they sand-blasted the frame in sections to preserve what straight steel they could find. Thad slowed that summer. He had a small heart attack in July and was in the hospital in Mount Sterling for 11 days. He came home thinner and quieter, but his hands still worked. He told Wyatt the truck would wait. By the 5th year, the frame was rebuilt and the cab was off, and the floor pans were patched in 20-gauge sheet. By the 8th year, they had a roller. By the 10th year, Wyatt's daughter was born, and they paused the work for a month for the diapering of new sleep schedules. In the 12th year, Thad sat more than he stood. He worked from a folding chair beside the wood stove now, his straw hat pulled low, the wheat straw cigarette still unlit between his fingers, and he pointed with his other hand at what to do next. Reginald Sterling Hatch had retired from the Lexington estate law firm by then and bought a horse farm outside Paris where he raised second-tier thoroughbreds for the smaller tracks. He drove past Thad's farm sometimes on his way to a sale, and the polished black Lincoln Continental never quite stopped on the road, but never quite passed either. By the 15th year, the Federal was painted. They had wet-sanded and primed and laid down a deep, glossy wagon master red on the cab and fenders, and they had masked off the driver's door with blue painter's tape around a rectangle where the flaking yellow junk paint still showed through, and they had left it there. Wyatt did not know why. He just left it. By the 18th year, the Holmes W750 booms were rebuilt and freshly painted flat black, and the cables were replaced with new aircraft-grade steel. The original twin hand cranks had been cleaned and greased. By the 20th year, the Federal was nearly whole. They had not yet touched the cab interior. The interior was the last thing on the list because Thad always said you start with what makes the truck move and you finish with what makes the truck a home. On the morning of October the 18th of the 20th year, Wyatt drove out to Thad's barn with a roll of new tan vinyl headliner and a bag of replacement clips and a fresh-cut sheet of cardboard for the Glovebox liner. He was 44 years old. The crow's feet at his eyes had deepened. The sandy brown hair at his temples was steady silver now, and the small scar across the bridge of his nose from a ratchet-strap kickback in 2010 was a faint white line. Thad was 96. He sat in his folding chair by the wood stove with a heavy plaid wool blanket over his knees, the straw cowboy hat pulled low, the wheat straw cigarette unlit between his fingers, and he watched as Wyatt climbed into the Federal's cab and opened the Glovebox door. The original cardboard liner inside the metal Glovebox was rotted at the edges and warped along the bottom. Wyatt worked the corners free with his fingertips and pulled the cardboard liner out of the metal frame. He set it on the bench. He started to throw the rotted cardboard into the burn pile, and he stopped. The cardboard was heavier than it should have been along its back edge. He turned it over. He pressed the cardboard between his palms. He heard the soft slip of paper sliding against paper. He sat down on the workbench. Thad lifted the wheat straw cigarette slowly out of his fingers. He said, "What did you find?" Wyatt did not answer. He took a single-edge razor blade from the bench drawer and ran it carefully along the seam where the back face of the cardboard liner had been glued and folded over itself into a long, flat double layer, and he peeled the back face open like the cover of a book. Pressed flat between the two layers of cardboard, hidden in a long, shallow compartment that ran the length of the liner, were four things. There was a thick packet of folded bills wrapped tight with a brown rubber band, 20s and 50s and 1970s Federal Reserve paper that he would later count on the bench at $2,400. There was a small leather-bound pocket notebook the color of a saddle, the spine still tight, the pages filled with careful slanted handwriting tracing a Coverdale family tree from a small town in County Wicklow, Ireland, in 1842 through 14 generations to a child named Naomi Ann Coverdale, born in Lexington in 1968. There was a silver class ring with a deep blue stone in the setting and the words University of Kentucky, 1956, engraved around the stone in narrow gold script. The inside of the band hand engraved with the name R.P. Coverdale, and there was a folded single sheet of plain, yellowed-lined paper, the creases brittle, the ink slightly faded, but legible. Wyatt unfolded it. The handwriting was the same careful slant as the notebook. The letter was dated June the 4th of 1984. It read, "To Naomi, my daughter, if anything happens to me on the road or in the barn, the cash is for whatever you need for college. The ring is for the boy you marry to ask for your hand from your mother, and the book is for you to read on the long nights when you cannot sleep. Keep the name Coverdale on your driver's license until you are sure the man deserves to put his name beside it. The truck is yours when you are ready to drive it. Your father, Roy Patrick Coverdale, Mount Sterling, Kentucky, June 4th, 1984. Wyatt set the letter on the bench. He read it twice. He handed it to his grandfather, and Thad held it in both hands and read it once and set it down. Thad said quietly, "Roy wrote this 9 months before the loft fell on him." They drove to Lexington the next Saturday. Thad had called a man he had known at the distillery whose niece worked at the Fayette County Clerk's office, and the man had found Naomi Coverdale Yates at a small horse farm on Old Frankfort Pike outside Lexington. They drove out under a clear Kentucky morning, whiteboard fences running for miles past mares grazing in front of the bluegrass, and they pulled into a long limestone drive and stopped in front of a red brick farm office with a hand-painted sign that read, "Coverdale Yates Thoroughbreds." The woman who came to the door was 56 years old. She had Roy Coverdale's wide cheekbones and her father's hazel eyes. She wore a dark green oilskin barn coat over a faded indigo riding shirt, dark jodhpurs, and tall brown leather riding boots scuffed at the calves. She looked at the two strangers on her step, and Thad spoke first. He said, "Ma'am, I knew your father. He worked on his Federal in my barn in 1978. My grandson here bought the Federal at your mother's estate auction in 2004, and we have been restoring her ever since. And we found something inside her that belongs to you." Naomi's face changed. She held the door for a long moment and then opened it wide and asked them quietly to come in. They sat at her kitchen table, and Wyatt set the 4 items down one at a time. The cash first, then the notebook, then the ring. He saved the letter for last. Naomi picked up the silver ring. She turned it slowly between her fingers and read the inscription. R.P. Coverdale. She set the ring down, and she picked up the leather notebook, and she opened it to the last page, and there was her own name in her father's careful slant. She picked up the letter, and she read it twice. She did not cry until the second reading. She said her husband, Jonathan Yates, had passed of pancreatic cancer in 2019. She said her daughter Lucy, named for her grandmother, was a third-year vet student at the University of Kentucky now. She said she had never owned a piece of jewelry her father had touched, and she had never seen her father's handwriting on anything but the front of a paid invoice. She held the ring in her closed palm, and she sat at the table with her eyes shut, and she did not speak for a long time. She asked finally if she could see the truck. They drove her out to Mount Sterling the next morning. Naomi stood in the open bay of Thad's barn in front of the Federal, and she walked around it 3 times. She ran her hand along the boom legs. She stood at the driver's door where the flaking yellow junk paint was still masked off in blue tape. She looked at the bench. She turned to Wyatt, and she asked the price. Wyatt looked at his grandfather. Thad held the wheat straw cigarette between his fingers and looked at Naomi for a long moment and said, "Ma'am, the truck is yours, but not the way you mean. We are going to finish her. We are going to paint over the junk so it is gone, and then we are going to drive her down to Mount Sterling and park her on Maple Avenue across from the old Coverdale hauling concrete block office, and we are going to paint your father's name on the door in white the way he had it in 1969. The boy paid $310 at auction. The truck is his on the paper, the work is his by the doing. But the name on the door belongs to your father and to you. They finished the Federal through that winter. Naomi drove up from Lexington every other Sunday, and she sat in the barn and watched Wyatt work, and she brought lemonade made the same way her mother had made it. On the morning of May the 2nd of the 21st year, they rolled the Federal out of the barn under a clear blue Kentucky sky, and they drove her in convoy down to Maple Avenue in Mount Sterling and parked her facing the empty corner where the Coverdale hauling office had stood until 1991. Wyatt handed Naomi a small can of deep red paint and a 1-inch brush. Naomi climbed up on the running board and she painted out the flaking yellow junk on the driver's door. She waited an hour. Then she opened a can of clean white lettering paint, and in her father's careful slant, she painted across the door in clean, clear letters, Coverdale Hauling, established 1973. The truck is yours when you are ready to drive it. She stepped down. A polished black Lincoln Continental went by on Maple Avenue. Reginald Sterling Hatch was driving. He slowed almost to a stop. He looked at the Federal and at the 4 people standing on the gravel, and he did not laugh. He drove on. The Federal sits on Maple Avenue in Mount Sterling today, and the sign on the door reads, Coverdale Hauling, established 1973. Naomi runs the horse farm on Old Frankfort Pike, and her daughter Lucy graduated from veterinary school in May. The silver University of Kentucky ring sits in a small wooden box on Naomi's dresser in Lexington. The $2,400 sits in a savings account in Lucy's name. The notebook is on the shelf in Naomi's office, and she reads from it on the long nights when she cannot sleep. The letter is in a small fireproof box in her closet. She reads it once a year on the 4th of June. If you ever see an old Federal 604M parked on a Kentucky main street with the words Coverdale Hauling painted on the door in clean white, slow down. Roll the window down and listen. There is a story in that truck that a man in a pinstripe suit tried to consign for $50, and the work was always for the daughter. Subscribe to Iron Hook Stories for a new story every day. Thank you for watching.